Hi, welcome to Spotlight Talks with Vix Jensen. So thank you for joining us. I'm Tash, and I'm now going to hand over to Vix to introduce herself.
Hi guys, thank you so much for being here. My name's Vix and I was born with a condition called cerebral palsy. It's a condition with a big spectrum of symptoms and a lot of different ways that it affects people. But in my case, it mainly affects my two lower limbs. So I walk with crutches full time, and it also causes quite a lot of chronic pain and discomfort too. So I am a writer and public speaker, and I'm coming to you today from Los Angeles, and I'm super happy to be here. And I think I'm just going to start by talking for 10 minutes or so, telling you a bit about me and a bit about some of my experiences as a disabled person, and specifically talking about hate and oppression, because that's what we're here to discuss. Is Hate Crime Awareness Week 2020. So if you'd spoken to me about 10 years ago, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with my disability in terms of what I wanted to do with my life. I would have said I wanted to do anything that could have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with my disability, because it was in a lot of ways the devil on my back, and I wanted to identify myself in any other way than as a disabled person. I wanted to be that person who did whatever she wanted despite my disability, and build an identity which would allow me to somehow forget about it. And then 6 years ago, I finished my master's degree in psychology, and I decided on a whim to pack one suitcase and move all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't completely random. I did fall in love with an American. So I decided to pack all my stuff and come here to Los Angeles. And that's when everything changed. Moving away from London, which was the place that I'd spent my entire child and teenagehood, was kind of my aha moment. When it came time to really carve my own space in the world as an adult, I realized that so often the way people interacted with me was based on their own preconceptions that they brought to the table. I would walk into job interviews or new places, and I would watch as people's eyes scanned me up and down. I would watch as the map of their faces changed while they took me in. When I moved to a new city and a new part of the world, I just stopped making excuses for all the places around me that had been inaccessible for the whole of my life. I opened my mind and dared to imagine a world where I didn't have to choose a restaurant or a bookstore or a house that was accessible, because they all would be. They all should be. I started asking myself tough questions. What if it's not my responsibility to fit myself into the world, around a world that isn't created for me? What if it could have been created for me? What if movement, my existence in the world, was my human right and not something I should apologize for? What if I stopped saying sorry for taking up space and instead used my voice to try and change the space that I did take up? What if I existed loudly and proudly and stopped waiting for the world to catch up? So that's when I started writing and speaking as much as I could about my experiences and those of other disabled people. I've used writing and speaking opportunities since to center stories of disability. I use my platform and my voice to fight for a world where the next generation of kids born with a disability can expect a world that will grow to fit them and their big hearts, their big souls. And they'll never, ever have to think about shrinking themselves to fit it like I did. I realized that as I was growing up, I'd not had the privilege of seeing people with disabilities hold the world accountable. I'd not seen myself represented or my experience reflected. So it made sense that instead of leaning fully into my experience and daring to imagine that world where I didn't have to change my shape, I had figured that if I could make that part of my existence as small as possible, then I might not have as hard a time. But life would always find ways to remind me that I just couldn't do that. So I want to rewind before I moved for a second and tell you about a difficult experience that I had, which is relevant to Hate Crime Awareness Week. So When I started university, I was 3 days into Freshers Week, exhausted, excited, overwhelmed, probably a bit ill. I'm sure any of you that went to university probably got the Freshers flu. But one night we're heading to a club and a bar for the night for some of that good old organized Freshers fun. And I already kind of knew that it might be a tough night because clubbing is just not my scene. But I thought, let's jump all the way in and go and meet new friends and see new people. So we get to Newcastle and we get to the club and we spend a little time in the bar upstairs. And I knew that to go clubbing, I would have to go downstairs. So after a couple of drinks, two friends that I had already made at university offered to help me down the stairs to the club area. We got a little bit of a head start because I'm a little bit slow downstairs and I knew the crowds would be pretty intense. I tried to make my way down the stairs and I kind of am stumbling a little bit. People are being patient around me at the beginning. And then suddenly, behind me forms this huge crowd of people that it turns out was a rugby club from a neighboring university. They clearly were not happy with how slowly I was going and how I was struggling to get down the stairs. It was very obvious that I was disabled because you can tell immediately my feet turn in and I walk differently than everyone else. And soon enough, I could sense that my friends around me were reacting to something that I wasn't really aware of because I was concentrating on not falling and not being trampled by the crowd. But when I tuned my ears to what was happening, I realized that the rugby club was chanting something. And they were saying, "Get her out. We don't want her here. No cripples in this club." And when I tuned my ears to that and the violence of it, I realized that actually, maybe I just couldn't ignore that this was the way some people saw me. This was the way that some people felt it appropriate to interact with someone with a disability. I immediately got really upset. My poor friends had no idea what to do. They were about 25 strong. It sounded like a football chant. And they just wanted to get me out of there as soon as possible. I decided that I wouldn't be going to the club. I got myself out of that crowd. The chant was ringing in my ears. I couldn't possibly believe that this was something that actually happened in real life. I drove back to Durham, cried all night, called the police the next day. They said it didn't qualify as a hate crime and that they wouldn't be pursuing any kind of charges against the club. And this isn't uncommon. Let's look at the numbers. 1 in 4 disabled people are victims of hate crime. And as of 2019, disability hate crime is rising year on year in the UK. But you know what? Prosecutions actually aren't rising. It doesn't make sense to have any conversation about hate crime awareness week, prejudice, bullying, or violence without including disabled people. So what does this all mean? Well, here's my theory as to why it happens. It's a simple cycle. Children don't see disabled people growing up. Their worlds aren't filled with different stories, different experiences, different ways of looking. They don't grow up with best friends who look different, speak different, feel different. They don't see them on their TVs or in their books. They don't play with them as their dolls. So they're ignorant of them. They just don't know because they were never shown. And from ignorance comes fear. We fear that which we don't know. Some say that it's as old as time, as evolutionary. It's a survival mechanism. You've never skydived, you don't know the feeling of it, chances are you'll be scared. You've never spent much time around dogs, chances are you'll be nervous around them. You've never been in a room with 5 academic professors before, a bit nerve-wracking. If most of those professors are in your family, then suddenly not so scary anymore. That extends all the way to different life experiences and ways of being. Our brains just tend to fill what we don't know with scary, big question marks and over-exaggeration, and that breeds fear. And fear often is what is at the root of any kind of hate, oppression, or aggression. I love this quote from Martin Luther King, who says it better than I ever could. He said, "Men often hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate, and they cannot communicate because they're separated." Now, you might say, but Vix, this all sounds pretty grim. What are we supposed to actually do about it? And to you, I say this: we all have a part to play in making this world softer, gentler, and more accepting for us now and for the next generation. We all have a part to play in holding space for other humans and their differences, a part to play in keeping our own minds and hearts open and ready, our friends' hearts and minds open and ready, our families too. We all have a part to play in making sure we continually learn about what's going on around us and about how the world looks to all the different people we share space with. And if we accept what we just said, that a lot of hate comes from fear and ignorance, I would say that's actually a bit of good news. It means that if we fight against that fear and ignorance by choosing to make our worlds more diverse, by choosing to tell stories and listen to stories, and by choosing to educate ourselves and others about things like disability, then suddenly there's a way to combat that hate. There's a way to change the conversations we're having. There's a way to change ourselves and the people around us. And so there's a way to change the world. So even if you think that disability has nothing to do with you, even if you're confused about where you fit into anything that I've said today, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go away and think about the stories you're telling, the world you're building, the stories you're hearing, and the ways in which you want to combat fear, ignorance, the ways you'll combat hate and divisiveness. How can you expand all those stories to make sure you're including more people and more difference? How can you play a role in making that softer, gentler world for everyone? Thank you so much for listening. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Vix. That was really, really interesting to hear, and it's definitely something that I could kind of relate to as a wheelchair user, obviously coming from a different standpoint there. Literally, no pun intended, but but it was interesting to kind of hear the similarities between experiences across different disabilities as well.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for young people growing up with disabilities and also their friends around them?
Well, for the people who are disabled themselves, I would just say, learn sooner than I did that you're entitled to take up space, whatever that looks like, right? I think we're taught that to make ourselves as small as possible, especially as girls and women, but everyone. And I think disabled people are taught that even more because the world is not built for them. And it can often feel, like I said, that you have to build yourself in the right shape for the world rather than the other way around. But I would argue that it's the world's responsibility to grow around you. So I just think that they should take up as much space as possible and as they're comfortable with, and be as loud as they're comfortable with. And in terms of their friends, just love them, you know? Like, my favorite thing about my friends is that they see past everything that makes me physically different, and they see who I am as a person, and they kind of accept that my disability comes with that. So yeah, just try as an able-bodied person to blow up your narratives around like being friends with someone who might be different than you, because I promise that a lot of good can come from it.
How do you think, you mentioned kind of fear and ignorance being a huge factor in why kind of this hate crime sort of exists and perpetuates. How do you kind of feel that that feeds into hate crime?
Listen, I mean, I think that we're scared of what we don't know, and we're scared of what feels other to us. And like I said, you know, at the very, very start of things, that might be evolutionary in the sense that we have a kind of self-protective mechanism of going with our in-group and rejecting whoever is seen as the out-group. But that's pretty easy to remedy by just making disabled people more visible and making them more represented in the media that we all consume and in the lives that we all live. And I feel very strongly that if that were the case, we would have less crime, especially towards disabled people, because they would just be a part of all of our lives, equally represented as any other group of people. And I just think that that would make people more accepting, and that would normalize different experiences. I think I feel really strongly that most of it is coming from fear.
I think we've just had a question come in from Ellie about what people can do if they see something like that happening, like the situation you experienced in the club. What can people do as a bystander in that situation to kind of support you and challenge it?
So I think in my case, what was useful and what would have been useful, because I was so physically taken over by them, because they were a big group of people and I was just me being helped by one person, an actual like physical barricade would have helped, because there was just a lot of aggression and violence coming towards me and I was worried that it was going to turn physical. And so sometimes that can be helpful. But also just call it out. Like very often when people see a minority being attacked, they feel scared to call it out, which makes a lot of sense. They don't want to involve themselves in potential violence. But someone else calling it out and a bystander saying, I will not stand for this. This is a hate crime. You know, please just stop and be aware of what you're saying. Often that's enough to disarm someone, because they don't expect other people to get involved. And so they're suddenly just so taken aback that they kind of hear themselves and they stop. It sounds like a really simple thing, but that's actually what happens a lot of the time in terms of human behavior. It just takes people by surprise, so they stop.
I was going to say, you mentioned that being a woman also sometimes plays into people's perceptions of you, and other tropes that are quite often used when talking about people living with disabilities are kind of the inspirational or the damsel in distress kind of tropes. So how do you think this add into the perception of people with disabilities, and do you think it is kind of a gender aspect there?
So in terms of the inspirational piece, I think what's damaging there is it just flattens disabled people's identities, right? Disabled people are as complicated and three-dimensional as any other human, and to reduce them to just an inspiration to you as an able-bodied person, or to whoever is calling them inspirational, you're kind of just having them fulfill this one role, which is, if they can do it, I can too, therefore I feel motivated by their existence. And I think that to me is what's damaging about it, is that it just flattens them into this one-dimensional thing that exists to serve the majority of the public. And I really feel strongly about fighting for a perception of disabled people which is as complex and multi-layered and exciting and cool as any other member of the public. In terms of the gender piece, I mean, I think women just have often a tougher time of it in general, in the sense of they're less allowed to take up space than men are, generally, disabled or not. And obviously being disabled adds on to that lack of permission to take up space. So that's where that plays into it, I think.
Obviously, a lot of our young people are kind of in school at the moment, and some of them are looking at moving into the workplace kind of as they grow up. So what advice do you have for young people with visible or invisible disabilities going into the workplace?
I would just say primarily don't apologize for yourself. I know that that's something that I have worked on for the entirety of my adult life and will continue to work on probably until the day I die. The easiest thing to do is apologize for yourself, and apologize for any difficulties that your existence may cause in any way, but you shouldn't have to do that, because you have just as much of a right to exist as anyone else, and to go after the opportunities that you want. And in fact, it's the world's and the workplace responsibility to make sure that that space exists for you. So, I mean, that's an active thing, right? You really have to decide, like, I'm going to stop saying I'm sorry, but I'm going to stop saying, I'm going to stop formulating my sentences around an apology or around a, like, I don't want to be a bother, but, and it takes time. And I think it's so ingrained in all of us, not just those of us with a disability, but even more so for those of us with a disability, because the way that people interact with us has made us used to feeling like a nuisance, when we are not a nuisance. We're just trying to exist peacefully in the world. So I reckon just really try really hard to not apologize for yourself.
I think that's really good advice as well, especially in terms of people feeling awkward around even just discussing things as simple as easier access into the building with colleagues and with managers. I know the building I'm in, we've got quite a steep ramp, and I know that was something that I was quite worried about talking to my manager about. And so things that are as small as that wouldn't even be a consideration for anyone else,
Exactly.
it can seem quite daunting.
Definitely.
We've got a question in the chat from Gillian, which is, what is your reaction to people so overtly using harmful ableist language in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sadly, it doesn't surprise me. This has been a situation that we've ended up with that has created an environment where it's acceptable to be ableist, which was already the environment. It's just more obvious now because everyone's going through the same thing. So sadly, it doesn't surprise me. What I would say is that it should also remind people that none of us are too far from the disability experience, right? No one really knows how COVID would affect them. And I think it's easy to separate yourself as a non-disabled person from the disabled identity and to think, this is not relevant to me, and none of these issues would ever affect me. But with how many people have been affected by COVID, for how many people it's going to turn into, maybe, hopefully not, but maybe like a lifelong chronic symptomatic condition, I think it should remind us all that these issues affect us all, and that we all have a responsibility to make the world more accessible. I think something that has come up for me is how quickly the whole infrastructure changed to make way for virtual meetings, for people not doing things in person, right? And I have been fighting for that in my professional life ever since I was old enough to do that. And people have told me it's too complicated to make things virtual. People have told me it's too complicated to work part-time or from home or whatever it is. And then suddenly the world changes, and with the click of a finger, we're all doing it. So I think, I feel that it is really harmful, the language that we're hearing around, like, oh, just isolate the people with pre-existing conditions or who are sick or whatever. And it really has shown me, reminded me how the world feels about disabled people. But it's also a great time to change all of those narratives and to call out ableism when you hear it.
You touched on it a little bit in that answer, but on a kind of positive question, what positives do you think are starting to come out of this situation in terms of disability awareness and kind of people bridging that?
So I think we've shown that like the world can change, right? So often when we're fighting for human rights in any sense, it can feel really discouraging when it takes a lot of time for small changes to happen, when those changes are so incremental, those changes towards universal access and universal design and making sure as many people are included as possible. But with COVID, a lot of things have been accelerated in terms of showing how we can make the world accessible and easier to live from home and all of those things. And so for me, that's a massive positive, because my hope is that we won't forget all of these changes that we've been forced to make in the wake of the pandemic, and that maybe all this time that we spent at home and connecting virtually will stay in the back of people's brains and remind them how easy it is truly to make things accessible to a much wider pool of people. So I feel really positive about that.
Got another question from the chat, which is, what key steps can youth organisations like Spotlight take towards becoming more inclusive towards young people with disabilities?
So, I mean, I think, the exercise of inclusion is a constant one. So if you think of diversity and inclusion as a goal, you're probably going to fall or fail somewhere along the way. It should just be a continuous thing that is always a part of any conversation you're having about the services that you provide. So it's not something that you can just solve, like it's not a puzzle that you can just put the Rubik's Cube in the right place and it's done. It's just a commitment that you have to make. So I think the key step for organizations such as Spotlight is to make that commitment and make sure that it's showing up in every single conversation that you have. So, do you have disabled people sitting at your table? Do you have disabled people advising you on the services that you provide? Do you have disabled people on your board or in your directorate? All of those things. So just make sure nothing about us without us is what we say. So just make sure that the disabled voice is represented, and that, like I say, it's a constant endeavor rather than something that has an end point.
How can young people help in tackling or addressing disability hate crime in day-to-day life? So kind of what small steps can we all take day to day that kind of add up?
So in terms of our own private steps, I would say, ask yourself the tough questions of does any of the media that I consume feature any disabled people in any meaningful way, and if anyone wants recommendations of TV shows or whatever that do feature disability in a cool way, then I'm happy to provide it. But just do kind of an audit of the information that is coming to you, and ask yourself, is it representative of the widest possible group of people? And then in terms of what we can do as a society, I think it sounds really basic, but for me, it's an active thing, which is always to lead with kindness and acceptance myself, and therefore call people in gently and kindly and whatever. But if you see ableism, if you catch people using language that is uncomfortable even to you, maybe as a non-disabled person, call people in and say, explain to them why that's problematic, and so love out and call in, I would say.
What's the biggest thing for you that you think has changed kind of how you perceive yourself in kind of society as a disabled person, and being able to speak out and stand up for you taking up that space?
I mean, I think I realized that no one else was going to do it for me, that I could ignore it as long as I wanted to, that I could say that, you know, I was going to be able to exist just as well as any other person in the world, and that it was my responsibility to do that. But then I realized that the world wasn't budging, and that for the rest of my life I was going to be fighting an uphill battle against a world that wasn't built for me, unless I actually used my voice and said, no, I want to change. They say, you know, be the change that you want to see in the world. And I come on the heels of lots of incredible disability activists and people who are working in the space and have been working in the space for much longer than I have. But there are never, ever, ever too many voices. And I think I'm doing it for the little girl that I was, who craved so badly to see an adult who would tell her that it was okay to be loud, and it was okay to be angry, and it was okay to hope for a world that would be better. And so I'm really doing it for her, and I hope that if there's another little girl born with my disability or any other tomorrow, that she might be able to grow up in a softer and kinder world, and I have to be a part of that. I don't have a choice.
That's such a great answer.
Well, thank you.
If anyone does have any questions for Vix, please do kind of ask them on here. I think there's a chat box or a Q&A box where you can put them, and we would love to hear your questions, and I'm sure Vix would love to answer them. So please do put them in there.
Nothing off limits here.
You mentioned seeing representation in the media as being kind of a big step. What sort of representation have you seen, and what sort of representation do you think there needs to be more of going forwards?
So a few years ago, I think it was like 6 years ago, I watched Breaking Bad, and that was the first show that I saw that had a disabled character that was not defined by his disability, in the sense that the show was not in any way about the fact that he was disabled, and that character, who was the main character's son in the show, he was actually played by someone with cerebral palsy, which is the disability that I have. And so seeing that on screen, and seeing that it wasn't some kind of sob story about how awful his life was or whatever, he was just existing as a disabled person playing this character on screen, and they didn't really ever talk about his disability. It was such a small thing, but it made such a difference to my life, because I was like, wow, like this is just someone who happens to be disabled, but who also has like a rich life, and, you know, a father who's going through some stuff, and it just feels amazing to see that. And then more recently, I saw a show called Speechless with Minnie Driver, which is also a really amazing show, which is about a kid with a disability, also played by someone who has an actual disability. I think also cerebral palsy. I didn't seek it out because of that. It just happened to be the case. But it's about how the family and the kid like accommodate his disability into their lives, and the view from the outside, like how people are interacting with him. And it spoke to such a huge part of my experience as a kid. And I think like I watched it and I thought, wow, this could be really transformative for someone who's never experienced disability or had a family member experience disability. But I think like the fact that I can come up with 2 examples, and that's pretty much it, like is abysmal, frankly, like absolutely abysmal. We should be asking for as much disability representation in media as we're seeing for every other minority, and we're just not seeing that yet. I want to see stories that feature people who are disabled, but who have so much else in their story, and like you know, that it's not necessarily front and center. They just happen to look different or be different, or and we're just not seeing that yet. So hopefully I'll have many more examples to give here in a few years' time.
And like you said as well, seeing that representation using actors who have the lived experience as well, not just actors who are playing the role of a disabled person, but people who can bring that.
100%. Disability is not a costume, right? Like, this is all what I say. And I'm not interested in able-bodied actors being awarded for like the tough ride of playing a disabled person. And that's what happens. Like, people get Oscars, people get other awards for how rough it was to portray a disabled person. And I'm just not here for that, because like, my identity is not a costume, it's an identity, and so it should be inhabited by someone who understands that.
Got another question from the chat, which is, what resources or support could you recommend for young people living with disabilities?
I wish I could recommend more. I think like, it's a bit of a blind spot still in society, but I was really helped by an organization called Scope, which used to be cerebral palsy specific. It's a UK organization. It used to be cerebral palsy specific, but now I think they've widened their access to any kind of disability. Mm-hmm. And they do really great work, lots of different type of work, but they have like a blog space where people with disabilities write blog posts. They have a forum space where you can ask questions. I have found the most helpful things are things like Facebook groups, which you kind of have to go in search of yourself, but basically like anywhere that builds a community. And I think Twitter, like the Spoonie community on Twitter, Spoonies is just one word for how some disabled people like to identify themselves. But Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, amazing disability community on Instagram. And yeah, so that's what I would recommend, like, search social media for that kind of thing.
Sorry, my internet doesn't seem to be doing great today. I was going to say, yeah, a lot of the charities for different conditions and different disabilities are also starting to open up young people's support meetings as well, which are also a great source of support, and not just support for the individual, but they quite often have family meetings. So you can kind of spend time as a family in a space with other families going through similar things, which is quite nice.
I think the most important thing you can do is find community, basically. Like, I know that my whole attitude to my experience changed when I found that other people, when I found that glint of recognition in other people's eyes, right? Because before then it had felt so lonely, even though I knew that there were so many other people with disabilities living around the world. I was like, where are they? Like, the fact that even I, as a disabled person, have to like search for representation, not just in media, but also in my life. I just think like, yeah, finding community changed all of that for me, because I realized that it wasn't just me.
Yeah. I seem to have lost all the questions in the chat where my phone disconnected and reconnected. How others in chat waiting to be asked? It just
I don't think there are
from my
at
screen.
the moment.
Okay, that might have just been me missing extra questions. I had a question in my head and I've completely forgotten it.
Happened. Oh, what are my plans for 2021? Asks Harry. I mean, who knows is the answer to that question, in the sense of, I don't know what the world will be doing in 2021. So right now my plans are just to stay healthy and stay safe, and find some quality of life in amongst these weird times. But I would really, really hope to be able to do more in-person events. Like usually I speak in person and I love doing that. I love seeing the audience. I'm so sad that I can't see people's faces, but yeah, so I would really love to be doing more in-person events, both in the US and the UK. I would love to come and see Spotlight in person. That would be really exciting. I've been doing some work for Spotlight for a few months now, and I would love to see it in person. So yeah, I mean, who knows? Lots of time to fill, lots of exciting opportunities.
We've got another question from Ellie, which is, do you find the US more accessible than the UK, both in terms of attitude and in terms of physical access?
That is a very good question, and one that I have not quite made my mind on yet. So I think the thing with the UK is that it's much, much older than the US. And the excuse for the lack of accessibility in a lot of buildings is the fact that the buildings are super old and they don't want to break them down and replace them with newer buildings because the buildings have historical significance. And so, yeah, so there's that. Like a lot of buildings in the US are much newer and they just have the infrastructure to make them much larger and allow more space for like ramps and elevators and other, access needs. So from a purely physical perspective, I would say that just because of the type of buildings and the amount of space, the US is probably more accessible. In terms of attitudes, governmental attitudes are actually better in the UK, which is saying something given that there's a lot of room for improvement in the UK government in terms of how they tackle disability and how they give out benefits and all that stuff, but still better than the US. The US have a lot of very, very outdated attitudes to disability. It's still legal to pay disabled workers less than $1 per hour for their work, for example. And also it's much, much, much more difficult to access benefits. Like you have to have worked and you have to have basically contributed to the US economy in some way or another before you're entitled to any kind of benefits, which obviously is really problematic for people who are not able to work because they're too sick or too disabled. So yeah, I think there's lots of room for improvement on both sides of the pond, but that would be my view for now.
You mentioned earlier that you're doing this and all the advocacy kind of for your younger self. Do you have anything in particular that you wish you could have heard when you were sort of at secondary school age?
That's another good question. There are some things that I wouldn't have wanted to hear, which is that like it will stay hard. Like that's the honest truth of the matter, is that like it's still hard, and in a lot of ways as an adult it is more difficult. My experience of disability is more difficult, A, because my body is getting older, but B, also because I'm less cocooned and sheltered, because I live, my own life now, and I'm responsible for all the adult things that adults are responsible for, and a lot of those are made harder by the fact of like not having as much physical access to the world. So that answers the opposite to your question, which is like not what I would have wanted not to hear. But I think what I would have wanted to hear was that I was going to find my voice, and I was really this feels really like self-indulgent to say, but that I was going to make a difference to younger people and their experiences of their disability. Like my work has allowed me to see directly the impact that I've had on some young people. Like I gave a talk in Boston one year, which was about the way that the internet can be such a safe haven for people with disabilities and a way to find community, as I mentioned. And also that the internet allows people to form their identities the way that they want. So on the internet, when I first walk into an internet room, people can't see that I'm different. So I am allowed to divulge the information that I want to about my disability when it feels comfortable for me, which is the opposite of what I experience day to day when people see me, because they immediately make that snap judgment about how I look, how I move, how I take up space. Anyway, so I gave that talk about the internet, and the next day I left back to Los Angeles, and I was in Boston airport, and someone came up to me, and I had never seen them before, and they said, "Can I just talk to you for a second?" And this man said that his nephew had been in my talk the day before, and that he was nonverbal autistic, and that he hadn't stopped talking about my talk from the day before, that he had felt so seen, that the internet had provided so much community for him, and that no one around him really understood it because they weren't internet people. And he thanked me basically for just giving him a voice for that small amount of time. And I realized, again, feels really self-indulgent to tell that story because I'm not ringing my own bell or giving myself a medal, but I realized that my voice was actually going to have a tangible impact on other people. And I would really, really love to tell my younger self that, because I think she would be absolutely amazed.
And it comes back again to that community as a support system as well. And something that you've done amazingly is build yourself into that community and into that support network for so many people who are growing up just like you did growing up now.
Yeah, 100%.
My question though, Vix, was to do with like how organizations internally can change the way they recruit so that the kind of the average workforce contains a greater proportion of people who have disabilities, because at the moment the average proportion is very low, right? But how can we diversify recruitment practices so that changes?
So another great question. I think there's opportunities at every point in the process, right? So there's opportunities in terms of external communications. So like when you are advertising yourself as a company, like are you using like the stories and experiences of people with disabilities? Are you making whatever product or service that you offer inclusive to where people with disabilities will actually be motivated to work for your organization, right? Because if they don't see themselves like represented in your product or your service, then they're not going to be interested in working for you. So that opportunity in external communications. And then inside the business, I think a lot of conversations need to be had about like the hiring process, and is the hiring process accessible, and how can we prevent ourselves from bringing our biases to the hiring process. Because actually what I always say is that disabled people are they have a lot of resilience and a lot of grit, and their entire existence is based on finding solutions that are out of the box, that require creative thinking to be able to exist in the world. And all of those attributes that I just listed are things that should be really attractive to anyone recruiting for any company. And so I always encourage like the higher ups at any company to really try to like blow up their narratives, my favorite phrase, but blow up their narratives when it comes to disability, and to think like, okay, there's potentially this whole huge untapped pool of people, resourceful people who we could be looking into, and we're not. So do you have disabled people at your table advising you on that stuff?
I'm so sorry about my internet today. I don't know what's going on with it. I was just saying one question I did see in the chat before the last time my internet disappeared was from Ellie, which was, what do you think of the idea of reasonable adjustments with employers and how that plays into kind of creating more access in the workplace?
So that's a bit of a complicated question for me to answer, because I exist between the US and the UK that have like some different rules. But what I will say is that in both places, there are actually laws that require employers to make the equivalent, if it's not called a reasonable adjustment, which I think it is under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But anyway, they require employers to make adjustments for you if you require them to work at the same level of productivity that you're able to. And that kind of goes back to what you and I were saying, Tash, before, which is that, like, if you're protected by the law, you should not feel like a nuisance or problematic for requiring of your workplace what you need to be at your best and perform your job as well and as easily as possible. And everyone should require that of their employers, whether they're disabled or not. Otherwise, like, you shouldn't be expected to hold up your end of the bargain, which is to do your work properly. So I think, like, you know, we have a lot of work to do in terms of enforcement of the actual law, because a lot of employers tend to feel like they're above the law, and that if it's going to be in any way problematic for them to implement, they just won't bother. But I would say, like, in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and in terms of any legislation, even in the UK, people shouldn't think of it as like this threatening thing that's going to be used to like sue them if it goes wrong or whatever. The laws just exist to facilitate a conversation between a disabled employee and an employer of, like, these are the things that I might need to be able to do my job well, and these are the ways that you can implement them and be supported by the government in doing so. So I think if we change our view of legislation from this like scary thing that can be used to like sue people and bring them to court, to this thing that just like enables communication between two people, then we'll do better. And, you know, you won't be taken to court if you don't do anything wrong. So
I think as well, changing it so that businesses and employers see it as kind of something that makes it accessible to more people, rather than giving
100%.
special consideration just to one person. There was a cartoon I saw a while ago, and it was clearing the snow off the steps and the ramp, and they were clearing the steps first, and the person in the wheelchair was saying, well, if you clear the ramp, all the people walking around on two legs can use the ramp as well, but I can't use the steps. And it is kind of changing that attitude to,
and that's what I always
say.
And I know we're running out of time, but that is what I always say about universal design, is that it does not hurt anyone, and it just helps more people, right? So making a building accessible, to me, is not going to make it less accessible to any person without a disability. So we can actually, and it might make it more accessible to that person even when they're not disabled. So we're only making the world bigger, making the world fit more people when we implement, you know, accessibility and universal design rules, rather than making it smaller. And I don't understand why anyone would not want to do that.
And you're right, we are coming towards the end of this Spotlight Talks. So just for people who do still have questions, how can people get in touch with you, find out more about your work, or seek advice with you, or work with you in the future? How can they get in touch with you after this talk?
I have a website, which is vixjensen.com. That's VIXJENSEN.com. And there's a contact form on there, which goes straight to my email if you want to contact me. I'm available for any and all speaking opportunities, but also to answer any questions you might have. I'm also on Twitter at Vix Jensen, so you can tweet me there. I tweet about disability stuff. I'm also tweeting a fair bit about the US election right now, so please excuse that. Hopefully it won't be for much longer. But yeah, so my website and Twitter are probably the easiest ways to get in touch. And I work across the UK and the US, so don't be afraid if you're in the UK.
So we are coming to the end now. So just thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your story today, Vix.
No problem. It was my total pleasure. And thank you, Tash, for the amazing questions. And
hopefully, once all this COVID palaver is done, we'll see you at Spotlight sometime.
Would absolutely love that. Would be the best ever. Thanks, guys.
Thanks to everyone who's joined in. I think there is another talk going on. One of the other Spotlight talks is happening after this one. So go and check that out. I don't know if Harry's got the link.
Definitely,
around.
Yeah, or Ade, if you're still watching, maybe drop the Zoom details for that. It's with a Nigerian international footballer called Joe Aribo, and it's going to be hosted by Ade, who's the Get Active Development Officer at Spotlight. So yeah, I will try and quickly find the link to that and put it in the chat. But yeah, just to echo what Tasha said, thanks so much, Vix. Really excited to work with you more in the future and get you involved in how Spotlight can work towards becoming more accessible. And yeah, thanks to Tash, who's been amazing, an amazing host, and is also a member of the Spotlight family as a youth support placement with us, was and sort of still is as well, which is lovely. So yeah, I'm going to quickly find the link to the next Spotlight talks.
Thank you to everyone who's joined in and listened and asked questions. Hopefully you've kind of taken something from this kind of going forward that you can just to learn something new or to get a better understanding.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I don't know if I should click out or if I should wait for someone else to click out.
I think we're just finding the link. So that's the link there for anyone who wants to go to the talk with Ade.
Yeah, the next one starts at 6:15, so you've got time to make a cup of tea and get yourself comfortable again. And yeah, I'll see you guys in there. Thank you so much, Vix. Thank you so much, Natasha, and thanks to everyone who's been watching, and see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Cool, bye.